welcome to our second, I'm sorry. Oh, okay. Well, welcome to our webinar today. First, I'd like to thank our esteemed panelists for agreeing to join us for today's webinar. And I would like to thank you all for joining us for this interesting panel. This webinar is organized by the Center of International Business Education at Michigan State and Texas A&M Universities as part of our Research Spotlight series. The topic of today's webinar is using cultural distance in international business research, tips and trends. David Griffith from Texas A&M University and I will be your co-hosts today. I'm Ahmet Kirca. I'm an associate professor of international business and marketing at Michigan State University Broad College. And I also serve as the director of the International Business Center, MSU Cyber at MSU. David is the Hallie van der Heider Chair in Business, Professor of Marketing and Associate Director of Research at the Center for International Business Studies at Texas A&M University. We have 3 international business marketing scholars who have recently published important work on the measurement of cultural distance. Our first panelist is Professor Palitha Konara from University of Sussex, and he's going to talk about correctly specifying the Kogut and Singh cultural distance measure. Our second panelist is Dr. Wolfgang Messner from the University of South Carolina, and he'll talk about geometrical measurement of cultural differences. And our third panelist is Dr. Teresa Dean from Ball State University, and he's going to talk about recommendations. His discussion topic is going to be about recommendations for using cultural distance in academic research. We would appreciate if you could write your questions to David and send us via the chat function. David will monitor the chat box closely and group them and pose the questions to the panelists. Please enjoy. We're going to start with Palitha, and then continue with Wolfgang, and then with Teresa. Take it away, Wolfgang.
Palitha will start.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. I think it's good evening, right? Yeah, it's midnight here in the UK. It's exactly midnight. So I'll share my screen. Right. So can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a paper that we published in 2019 in Management International Review. So I co-authored with Professor Alexander Moho from Vienna University. And yeah, so this is basically about specifying this cultural distance index introduced by Kogut and Singh in 1988. I'm pretty sure most of you might be very familiar with this index. So Kogut and Singh introduced this, introduced a composite index to calculate the cultural distance between 2 countries using Hofstede's 4 national cultural dimensions of power, distance, uncertainty, avoidance, individualism, and masculinity. And so it's more than how many years old? Yeah, more than 30 years old paper, and it's heavily cited. And so Kogut and Singh index remains the most widely used measure or approach to measure cultural distance. So if you look at the citations, you can see it's heavily cited, and it's one of the top cited papers in international business as well as in the management field, if you take it broadly. So So what is the problem with co-dancing index? So in our paper, we show that this index is not correctly specified. It's actually incorrect. It's not correct. It's incorrectly specified. And even though it intends to capture the cultural distance between two countries, it actually captures the squared cultural distance. And this inaccuracy is problematic because then the empirical findings on the effects of cultural distance are likely to be misleading, because if you're going to use a squared function of cultural distance, and if you assume that you are fitting a linear model, the results that you will get will be misleading. And we try to explain this misspecification in our paper. And we also specify the correct form of the distance measure based on the Euclidean distance. And then we also look at the implications of using this incorrectly specified co-dancing cultural distance index. So I think a lot of people in international business area, they think that co-dancing index is same as Euclidean distance. And many papers, even some of the recent review papers, meta analysis, all these papers, they even refer the co-dancing index as Euclidean distance measure. But actually, it is not an Euclidean distance measure. There's a big difference between the two. So I'll try to explain it. So you can see that, so the KSI index or co-dancing index, what they do is they take the cultural dimensions of one country, and for each dimension, they subtract, let's say if you take power distance, if there are two countries, A and B, so you subtract the cultural distance, power distance of A from power distance of B, and you take the distance in each dimension, and then you square it, and then you standardize it. So you standardize these individual distances, and once you standardize them, you sum them up. So co-dancing, they initially use these 4 dimensions. So for each dimensions, they calculate the distance, square it, and standardize it and square it, and then they divide it by 4. So this is where the big difference is. In Euclidean distance, you don't divide it by 4. You take the square root. And if you look at the equation here, down here, so you can see in Euclidean distance, you do the same thing. You take the distance between one dimension, and then you square it, and you add the dimensions or the distances in dimensions, and then you take the square root. But I don't know why they decided to divide it by 4 instead of taking the square root, but this makes a huge difference. So so basically we can use the Euclidean distance to measure the cultural distance in a 4-dimensional framework. So you can see that it's k equals 1, 2, 4. So there are 4 dimensions. You take the difference in each dimension, square it, and then add the 4 differences, and then take the square root. So that's how you calculate the Euclidean distance. But we can use the Euclidean distance. So there's a difference between it. So if I go back to my previous slide, there's a difference between the KSI index, the one at the top, and the Euclidean distance. That is co-dancing. They standardize the distances. Euclidean distance doesn't have standardized we can use Euclidean distance by standardizing it. So instead of plugging in distances, what we can do is we can standardize each distance. So we take the distance, subtract the mean, and divide by standard deviation. So then basically you standardize it, and then you subtract the other standardized measure in the other country, and then you take this distance, square it, and then take the square root. So you can do this, you can use the same approach, the standardizing approach, using Euclidean distance as well. And so if once you do this, this equation will be transformed into this. So if you compare these two, the KSI index and the standardized Euclidean distance index, the difference is, the only difference is this one, the Euclidean distance has a square root, the KSI index doesn't have a square root, it is divided by 4. So if we equate it to co-dancing index, the relationship is like this. It's so the co-dancing index is equivalent to standardized Euclidean distance squared divided by 4. So this is the relationship between Euclidean distance and co-dancing index. So
if I could interrupt you for just a second, a quick clarification question.
yes.
Is the inappropriate formulation of the KSI, will that provide an overestimation or an underestimation of cultural distance?
It depends. I'll come to that question in a minute, David. Okay. Hello.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah, because I'll be discussing about. I think it will depend on various things. I'll be discussing a bit about it in the next couple of slides. At larger values, it's overestimates. At smaller values, it underestimates. It's a very comparative in nature. But I'll be talking about it in the next couple of slides. Okay, so as you can see, the relationship between the Euclidean distance and Kogut and Singh index is that Kogut and Singh index is a squared function of Euclidean distance. And when we were researching this paper, actually, I was reading some applied mathematics to understand what is going on. And then actually, this squared Euclidean distance is a construct used in applied mathematics. It's a one form of power distance. So they have something called power distance. So this is the formula for power distance, and the squared cultural distance. Sorry, squared Euclidean distance is when this t equals 2 and r equals 1. Right. So when t equals 2 and r equals 1, we get so this power distance formula transforms to a squared Euclidean distance. And if you look at the features of this squared Euclidean distance, applied mathematicians, they use it to place progressively greater weight on objects that are further apart. So if you want to like give more weight when to more distant objects, then this is a good measure to use. So because it's gives greater weights to larger distances. And most importantly, this is not a distance measure. So this is not a distance metric function because it doesn't fulfill most of the criteria that distance functions should fulfill. And most importantly, it does not satisfy the triangular inequality condition, which is one of the most important conditions that a distance function should satisfy. So I'll explain what this is. So if you take a triangle like this, you can see that this line AB should always be smaller than the sum of AC and CB. So that's the triangular equality condition. Right, so length of one side should not be greater than the other two sides, right? Otherwise, you cannot have a triangle. But the co-tensing index violates this. For example, if you use the KSI transformation for BC, it comes to 6.25. And if you use the KSI transformation to AZ, it becomes 6.25. And AB becomes 16. So you can see now suddenly 16, right, is larger than the addition of 6.25, because if you add 6.25, 6.25, you get 13. So 16 is larger than 13. So this is a big problem, because if you so basically say, if you go in a straight line, that will be longer than going in a through another, like if you don't go in a straight line, if you know what I mean, right? So it basically, the straight line, right, is longer than, so if you go from A to B is longer than going it via C. So that is because of this KSI transformation. And if you apply to a real scenario, if you take these three countries and if you calculate the Euclidean distance, so these are calculated based on real figures, real values of state cultural dimensions. So if you look at Slovakia, Sweden, and South Africa, and if you calculate the Euclidean distance, so this is the standardized distance, you can see it nicely matches, like distance between Slovakia and South Africa is 3, South Africa to Sweden is around 3 again, and Slovakia to Sweden is 6. But if you use the KSI transformation, you can see it completely distorts. And now, so South Africa is very close to Slovakia, and South Africa is also close to Sweden. So you can see what is happening here. But actually they are at the same distance. And how can then, so South Africa is far away from Sweden as well, because it's completely distorts. Because the distance between Slovakia and Sweden is 9, but distance from Slovakia to South Africa is 2.3, and distance from Sweden to South Africa is also 2.6. So you can see that it distorts everything. And again, this is again illustrated based on real figures. So what we did here is we used 3 countries where the cultural dimensions does not vary in 3 dimensions, but only varies in 1 dimension. So that's why we picked these 3 countries. And so we use this just a 1 dimension to calculate the cultural distance. So we first use the normal distance, because it's just 1 dimension. So if you look at from Peru to Turkey, this is the distance in individualism dimension, because in all other 3 dimensions, those countries are very kind of similar. So if you use just 1 dimension and calculate the cultural distance, so you get like these figures. And if you use Euclidean distance and use the real cultural dimensions and calculate the figures, you get this almost the same, like you are comparable. Like, for example, if you see here, the distance between Peru and Turkey and distance between Peru and France, the ratio is about 3 times, 2.5 times. But if you use the KSI index, this ratio is very, very high. So it's about 8 times. So again, it distorts everything. But yeah, it's a bit complicated. But what we are trying to do here is we take 3 countries where the 3 countries only vary in terms of 1 dimension. Other 3 dimensions, they are kind of at the same level. So that way we can easily compare how close the co-tensing index in terms of measuring the distance, because there's only 1 dimension, because other 3 dimensions, the distance is 0. And you can see it's completely distorts it. And if we graph Euclidean distance versus, standardized Euclidean distance versus Kogudank-Singh distance, you can see the ratio between the smallest distance and the largest distance is about 22 times. But if you use the KSI index, the ratio between smallest and the largest is about 500 times. So why would this matter? What are the consequences of using this by incorrectly specified index? So the first important issue is it's exaggerate large distance over small distance. For example, if you take 2, if you square it, it's 4. But if you square 8, it's 16. So you can see it exaggerates a lot if the larger distances are exaggerated a lot. And some studies, they have used cultural distance to model like curvilinear effects, like cultural distance will have a U-curve shape relationship with another dependent variable, or an inverted U-curve shape relationship with another inverted variable. But because the Kogudank-Singh index actually captures the square distance, so even though these studies are trying to fit a polynomial function, they end up fitting a quartic polynomial. So instead of fitting a polynomial function like ax squared plus bx plus c, they are actually fitting a polynomial of degree 4. But the problem here is not only they are fitting a polynomial of degree 4, they are also missing some of the elements in that polynomial. So they're assuming b is equal c 0 and d equals 0, because so basically because x is actually x squared. So when you plug x squared into x, it becomes x to the power 4, if you know what I mean. So basically what they have done is they are trying to fit a U curve, but actually they are trying to fit a W. And then people who have found a U curve effect, actually what they have found is the relationship is W. So again, it shows how misleading the findings are. And then if you take the moderating effects, almost all the papers, they have theorized a linear moderating effect, but actually they are testing a quadratic moderating effect because they are using the squared function of cultural distance. And then this also leads to wrong or misleading results if you take the average or total cultural distance. If I give you an example, if you add the cultural distance between 3 country pairs like 2, 2, 2, you get 6. And if you add, let's say 0, 1, 5, you also get 6. So they both come up to 6. But if you transform it using KSI transformation, this 2, 2, 2, 1, these figures become 1, 1, 1, and it end up becoming 3. And these 3 points, they end up becoming 6.5. So you can see even when you add although you should have got the same values, but because of this transformation, again, it distorts. So where if a study is adding or subtracting cultural distance, it doesn't make any, it doesn't give any meaningful results at all. And then we also have the problem with modeling added cultural distance, because recently some studies have tried to model added cultural distance. For example, okay, if you go to a culturally distant country, and now you want to go to another country from that country, so they want to measure the cultural distance not from the home country, from the nth country to n+1 country. So if you look at so let's say if the cultural distance to the nth country is 2 and cultural distance to n+1 country is 4, so the difference between those 2 countries is actually 2. But if you use the KSI transformation, this 2 becomes 1 and this 4 becomes just 4. And then you can see they again distorts it. Even though you go to one country and then goes to another country that is twice as distant than the first country, but actually when you use the KSI, it gives you a misleading indication that actually you are going to a country that is 4 times more culturally distant than the previous country. And because of all these distortions, as you can see, sometimes it's exaggerated, sometimes it's yeah, it creates a lot of distortion. So it's not a very uniform distortion. So because of that, then the studies that have done meta-analysis, they would also suffer because they cannot meaningfully interpret the aggregate results of these studies, because the bias is going to be very different depending on what you are doing. Yeah, so the conclusion is because of this distortion, we are questioning the validity of the accumulated research using the KSI index. However, in this paper, we cannot provide a solution that would allow a transformation of the wrongly modeled results to correct results, or we don't. I don't think we have a way to reinterpret these biased results. So the only recommendation that we can give from our study is the future studies should avoid using this KSI index, because it's not even a distance metric. So what has happened after we published the paper? I'm not entirely sure whether people have stopped using the Kogu-Dangsing index. It still gets a lot of citations. I think the paper also received a couple of awards very recently. So yeah, that is my presentation. I don't know whether it was a bit fast.
That was excellent. We do have one question in the chat that Rachel has posed, but we will hold that till the end since that's for all panelists. I'll simply remind everyone that if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. And we're going to hold all the rest of the questions until the end, to the open Q&A. So we will then move on to Wolfgang's presentation.
Okay, let me just quickly share my screen. Should work. So, hi everybody. I'm Wolfgang Messner. I'm with the Delaware School of Business at the University of South Carolina. And I think I'm going to build up on Palitha's work and criticize the Kogu-Dangsing index a little further. And I will provide an alternative way of calculating cultural distance using a geometrical measure of difference. So before I start, maybe a quick background about myself. I'm not a traditional IB scholar. In fact, I'm a late entrant into this field of academia at all, and especially into IB. I started my life in computing science and then slowly grew into marketing and into management consulting, then worked internationally and somehow finally managed my way into IB. And when I kind of read the first paper in IB using something called a Kogu-Dangsing index to measure cultural differences or distances, I was a little bit surprised that having a relatively strong background in numerical mathematics, I had never heard of a Kogu-Dangsing index before. And I was quite surprised why we in the field of IB need to have a special index to measure something which appeared to me relatively simple, the distance between 2 points in a coordinate system. Then I looked at the KSI Kogu-Dangsing index a little further, and you see it here once more. Palitha had already shown it to you. And I was especially worried about this variance correction factor. And somehow I never really understood why we need to correct that difference or this distance between coordinates by a variance correction factor. And even in the original paper by Kogut and Singh, there's not much of a reason given for that, other than, and I've quoted this below here, the deviations were corrected for differences in the variances of each dimension and then arithmetically averaged. So I was a little stunned. And this is when I started thinking, okay, what if I apply what I have learned in computing science? How would I solve this problem of measuring cultural differences? So first, once more about the Kogut-Singh index. So we have cultural weight vectors, and here these are two cultural weight vectors. Vector A is for one country, and you see here for the Hofstede, classic Hofstede dimensions, and the same for country B. And V is the variance of one cultural dimension across all of the countries which are measured by Hofstede or Globe or any of the other cultural frameworks. So when I looked at the KSI index and looked at the literature and the criticism, and I've obviously also built on the study using Palitha's paper, I found the following issues. So first, we have a problem with that cultural dimensions are not independent. And I think this is something that even Hofstede acknowledges, right? And the Globe study acknowledges as well. Whenever we look into cultural dimensions, there is a correlation between cultural dimensions. Hofstede in his original book has actually printed plenty of such scatter plots. So this variance correction factor, this accounts for the variance within a dimension, but not for the variance caused by correlations among these dimensions. And then we have another problem that Hofstede's dimensions are all on a scale of 1 to 100, but they're all calculated from different formula. So a score of 82 on power distance doesn't really mean the same as 82 on uncertainty avoidance. That is, a country position is not absolute, but it's a relative position. And we have a similar problem in the Globe study, by the way. The Globe study is a little more uniform in terms of that we're having a nice Likert type scale. But even then, when we're looking into the individual items of the Globe study, we have different scale anchors. There's a bit of recommendation out here to use the Mahalanobis distance to overcome the correlation between dimensions as well. This is certainly an improvement to the Kogut-Singh formula. But then we have other problems. That an actual variance correction mathematically would require a normal probability distribution of the scores. When we just look into the Hofstede dimensions, we find that only power distance and masculinity are normally distributed. And the two other dimensions, the other classic dimensions of Hofstede, individualism and uncertainty avoidance, do not show a normal distribution. So theoretically or mathematically speaking, we should not even be using a variance correction factor, because variance correction and standard deviation and all of these formulas depend on a normal distribution. Then we have another problem. The Hofstede dimensions, or even the Globe scores, are only available for a subset of the countries of this world. So, but the variance correction depends on the number of countries available. That is, if we would be conducting the Hofstede survey or the Globe survey for more countries, and we would be adding additional countries to our list of cultural dimensions, then the variance correction factor every time we add more countries would change accordingly. That could be understood as a form of a measurement error, but I think it's still problematic because the cultural difference between two countries doesn't change. Next problem, and this is more of an interpretation problem. This variance correction attaches different weights to each squared difference. This is what it should be doing. But if we actually calculate this, we are attaching a lot of weight to the masculinity factor because this variance here is lower. And we are attaching the least weight to individualism because this variance here is higher. So it basically means in this entire formula that we are giving the most importance to masculinity and the least importance to individualism. Interestingly, I think most scholars in IB would agree that individualism is one of the more important cultural dimensions, which has a lot of effect on a different couple of domains, customer service, marketing especially. So that might also be an explanation why the KSI delivers some inconsistent results in some studies. Now, when I read some paper somewhere that we could understand the cultural dimensions at certain weight vectors, then I thought, wow, let me think about it. If I would be using what I have learned in computing science and numerical mathematics and in linear algebra, how would I solve this problem totally differently? And I go back to linear algebra, and in fact, some reviewers in the journal submission process, they have argued that this is highly mathematically complicated. In fact, it isn't for someone who has done some studies in computing science, mathematics. This is really linear algebra and undergraduate classes, what you handle in the first 4 weeks. So linear algebra has two different ways of measuring differences. One is an arithmetic measurement of a distance in a coordinate system. This is what the Euclidean distance does. And this is what the Kogut-Singh distance does. And then we have a geometric measurement of the length and the direction of a vector in a feature space. So if we look at this diagram here on the right side, this is now a two-dimensional diagram. We have individualism, collectivism here as a dimension on the x-axis, and we have power distance on the other one. And here we have the cultural weight vectors of two countries, dimensional. This is Argentina and this is Austria. So that's the vector for one country. That's the vector for another country. And the geometric measurement of differences between these two weight vectors is looking at this vector, is looking at this angle, the theta here, between these two weight vectors. And there's a formula which calculates this, this angle. This angle is called cosine similarity, angular distance, angle of heterogeneity, or vector angle criterion in linear algebra. It goes by a couple of different names. I have here in my paper chosen the angle of heterogeneity because I think it brings out most appropriately that I'm looking into cultural differences between two countries. And it also works across multiple dimensions. Of course, we cannot visualize this for 4, 5, or 6 different dimensions. And we should also not making any attempt to visualize it between these dimensions. So my suggestion is here to use the angle of heterogeneity, that angle between two cultural weight vectors, as an overall measurement, as a summary statistics for the total difference between the culture of two countries. Now, this measure of cosine similarity, angle of heterogeneity, is a measure which is very, very frequently used in computing science, especially in computer graphics. If we have differences between two images, and colors in computing science are being represented in a 3-dimensional model, the RGB model. You all might remember all of the old-fashioned RGB monitors, the CRT monitors, and this is basically red, green, and blue as 3 different colors. And differences between two colors can be measured with the, traditionally measured with the cosine similarity as a formula. And this is especially important because color pictures, if you want to measure a difference between two color pictures, I do not want to look into illumination. I really want to look into absolute color differences. And this is where the theta here is especially strong. It doesn't look into illumination differences or absolute positions between two countries, but it looks into relative positions. And this is exactly what Hofstede's dimensions measure. They measure relative positions, but they don't measure absolute positions, as explained before. It's also used heavily in artificial intelligence. If I'm training neural networks or so, the cosine similarity is a formula which is a very traditional formula of measuring differences in artificial neural networks as well. And in spectral images, there are a couple of other such applications. So when we compare now a measurement using geometrical measurement with arithmetic measurement, then I have done this in two different ways. I have first used a technique, statistical technique called multidimensional scaling, where I'm using matrices of pairwise differences between objects to determine coordinates. And I find that the angle of heterogeneity has lower stress level and higher levels of variance explained in the Kogut-Singh index, which is pointing towards the angle of heterogeneity having an advantage over the Kogut-Singh index. And also the amount of conflict present in the data is less for the angle of heterogeneity. These are aspects that we look into when we do multidimensional scaling. And then I have borrowed an idea inter alia from Palitha's paper to compare the Kogut-Singh index with the angle of heterogeneity for all of the 6,600 country pairs that I can generate from the Hofstede dimension. And we see here the scatter plot. And this scatter plot really points, I mean, there's again a quadratic function, and in my paper, I have also compared this against the Euclidean distance and the Mahalanobis distance, but we really see that the differences between the two measurements are quite extreme, and especially that the fan out become larger the differences, the greater the cultural differences in both of these dimensions. So, to summarize here, I'm not really proposing a new approach to cultural differences, not at all. It is just a more, what I believe is a more reliable geometrical measurement as compared to the arithmetical measurement. So why is, I believe that arithmetic measures such as the Kogut-Singh index and actually also the Euclidean distance and the Mahalanobis distance for the reasons explained before are not quite suitable measures for cultural differences. They do not fully capture the construct, but cultural differences in IP research play a very, very important role. So I believe it is important that we spend some time and effort into developing a methodology which corrects and measures cultural difference in a correct way. And I hope my paper contributes in this process. I see that cultural dimensions are related, are correlated with each other. There's absolutely no doubt about this. Hofstede scores are relative positions. They're not absolute positions on the dimensions. The country scores of Hofstede are not normally distributed. We shouldn't really be using a variance correction factor mathematically at all. It's not the right measure to use here because we do not have a normal distribution. Country scores are not available, are only available for less than 50% of the countries worldwide. So as I explained before, that introduces some dynamic onto the Kogut-Singh index and the Euclidean distance measurement, which is not warranted. And I've also shown that a variance correction actually introduces what I think are counterintuitive weights. The angle of heterogeneity has a couple of advantages. It measures how different or how related two countries are based on common characteristics. The cultural dimensions do not have to be independent as compared to an arithmetic measurement in a Cartesian coordinate systems. I do not require equivalent measurement scales in the geometric measurements, and the results do not depend on the number of countries included. Even if I collect more data, as is currently ongoing with the globe study, the difference between two countries will still be the same. However, of course, I see a couple of potential issues as well. Obviously, the angel of heterogeneity is a little bit more complex to calculate than a Kogut-Singh index or Euclidean distance index. Yet I can still do it within a normal Excel spreadsheet. I need a couple of spreadsheets for that, but I can do it. I have provided in the paper published in the Journal of International Marketing the data for all of the Hofstede dimensions, for the 4 Hofstede dimensions. If anyone wants to use the data, just shoot me an email. I'm happy to send you the Excel sheet so that you don't have to type it in. And yeah, the other 2 issues is there's no difference detected with the angel of heterogeneity if the weight vectors are multiple of each other. However, this is totally theoretical. It doesn't really occur in the Hofstede dimensions. And the third point is I need at least 2 dimensions to calculate an angel of heterogeneity. The angel of heterogeneity doesn't work as a distance measure only for 1 dimension. And discussion in the IB literature is still out if we want to have an agglomerated cultural distance index, or if the cultural distance index should be calculated separately for each cultural dimension. Okay, that was my short presentation and an idea to calculate a cultural difference measure in a totally different way as compared to Kogut-Singh, Euclidean distance, or Mahalanobis distance. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Wolfgang. Now, we did have a question that came in sort of as we were transitioning speakers from SETA. And I do want to ask it because I think it's a clarification question really on presentation 1 and presentation 2. So this is the question. The speaker assumes birds' flight is how concept of cultural behavior, or how the concept of culture behaves. Walking distance on a spherical surface, such as the Earth, is quadratic. What makes the speaker think that culture is linear in the first place, but not some other alternative? So either Palitha or Wolfgang, if you'd like me to repeat that, or if you'd like to try to answer that. I think it's a fascinating question.
Yeah, so I can explain it. I think that's what we were trying to explain it based on a 1 dimension. So if you use just 1 dimension, and it's, let's say, if the cultural distance in individualism, that let's say 2 countries has scores 10 and 5, so the difference is 5, and then another 2 countries, let's say, have a difference of, let's say, 10. But the problem is, so if you square it, 5 becomes 25, 10 becomes 100. So that's where the problem is. We are not talking about the modeling a linear effect or modeling a non-linear effect. It's just the values are being squared. That's where the problem is. So actually, yeah. So you assume that the effect is linear, but then you plug in it in a non-linear fashion. That's where the problem is. Sorry, David, I can't hear you.
Wolfgang, would you like to comment on that at all?
I think that problem in the geometrical measurement does not arise at all. I'm not really looking at either a square root, and I'm also not looking at a quadratic measurement. I am really looking at the angle between 2 different vectors. So that's a totally different approach. I don't think that question applies to the geometrical measurement.
Excellent. Thank you. And we'll move on to our 3rd presentation by Dr. Teresa Dean. Teresa?
Okay, I will share my screen. All right. Can everybody see my presentation correctly? Are we good? All right. So I would also like to thank everybody for joining us, especially those of you who currently have midnight. I really admire you being here this evening. Now, I will be talking about cultural distance as well, just as the other speakers, but I will not be beating up on Kogut and Sig. So we're going to take a little bit of a different approach. And what I will be talking about is choices that we as scholars make, because most of us have probably used cultural distance in our research and noticed that there is a great variance in the choices that are available to us. And so I will base the talk today on research conducted with David Griffith from Texas A&M and Jessica Hoppner from George Mason University. And so we can all agree that cultural distance has been kind of at the front and center of the discipline. It's a very important construct that has been studied extensively, as evidenced by today's webinar. However, there has been a lot of concerns that were raised in terms of the cultural distance, and not just in the way it is formulated mathematically, but there have been also more broader issues brought up in terms of mixed findings, differences in terms of conceptualization, also transparency in reporting. And some reviewers even reject this concept of cultural distance, and they refer to it as this big black box. So these issues associated with cultural distance are quite vast, but our understanding of how the choices that we as scholars make impact our understanding of cultural distance within international marketing has been quite limited. So this is what we have set out to do, with the goal of providing various recommendations and guidance to the field. So I will summarize our findings today, and I will do this in 4 steps. So what we first did is that we looked at different choices that are available to scholars when it comes to cultural distance, and then how are these choices applied in actual published research. So we examined 83 international marketing articles and looked at the choices that scholars make. And then we're wondering, well, what are the consequences of these choices? And so we actually did an empirical examination based on data from a European OEM. And based on our findings, we then advanced a series of recommendations, or a kind of a good best practices for the discipline. So let's first look at the choices and the variations. We analyzed 83 articles, 61 of them were empirical. Now I will show you a lot of different tables. And the key goal of me showing you these tables is not necessarily to dive into the details of the analysis, but rather to show you the vast variety of choices and decisions that we as scholars make. So when we look at the general use of cultural distance, it is oftentimes predominantly being used as a direct effect or an interaction effect. Some studies, however, look at cultural distance as a dependent variable as well. Some research, as we see on the bottom of the table right here, some research examines cultural distance in isolation. So you're looking only at cultural distance, and other research includes other variables, institutional variables, for instance, such as regulatory distance or economic or country risks, and so on. So we see a great variability in the use of cultural distance already. However, what we were also wondering is, what is the alignment between the actual measurement and the definition of the construct? And what we should see is that these two should match, right? So if I, as a scholar, use a specific measurement, for instance, building my measurement on one of the cultural frameworks like Hofstede, then I should also use specific conceptualization. And what we found is, usually if the authors use a general measurement, they also define the construct generally. However, that is not so if specific measurements are applied. We see that about half of the paper use a specific conceptualization, whereas another half of the paper actually use general conceptualization. So we see that sometimes there is this misalignment between the conceptualization and the measurement. And when we're talking about choices, there's a lot more choices that are available to scholars when it comes to format. Okay, so we have mentioned already by previous speakers as well that there are various cultural frameworks, such as Hofstede, there's Schwartz, there's Globe. So there's different cultural frameworks, and each one of these frameworks has different dimensions. And so we as authors have a choice to either use an aggregate measure or to examine the effect of the individual dimensions. And we see that most research predominantly usually uses a composite score and looks at the aggregate measures of cultural distance. Some, and I would like to note this, some research papers actually use both aggregate and individual measures to kind of show consistency across different formats. In terms of the cultural frameworks that are used, we again see a great variability. We see that Hofstede is the most popular framework that was used in our sample. But it's also important to note that some scholars do not really even state which framework they are using or which dimensions of cultural distance are actually being used in the research. So this is not where the variability stops. I still have more tables coming. So when it comes to measurement, oftentimes scholars also use a different number of dimensions. So if we look at application of Schwartz and Globe, what we see is that scholars typically use all of either 7 or 9 dimensions. However, it's not like that when we look at Hofstede, which is actually has very important implications for our research. The most popular amount of dimensions used is 4, which were part of the original framework. However, what we found is that half of the papers were actually published after this cultural framework was extended to 6 dimensions. And this is oftentimes reflected kind of in the approach of the authors, where some scholars believe that we should be using all of the dimensions in order to capture the phenomenon, whereas others believe that we should only use the dimensions that are theoretically driven. And to touch on mathematical formulations, it's been discussed in detail by our speakers, but as you can see, Kogut-Singh is actually the most popular one that is used by scholars. So that kind of gives a shout to our speakers here that they're examining an important topic. But we also see that quite a few research papers, 25% actually use the Euclidean distance, and some other ones use absolute value. So there is really no agreed upon approach or formulation in the literature. And so when we look at these findings, the key takeaway is there is a lot of choices that scholars make when we're looking at cultural distance. And that certainly must have implications for how we understand cultural distance in our research. And so what we set out to do next is to look at the consequences. So what are the consequences of our choices? So we conducted an empirical test based on data from a European OEM and its suppliers located in 11 different countries. And we tested a simple model, really, that supplier innovation will positively impact supplier sales to the OEM. This relationship has been quite well established in the literature, and within international marketing, this relationship is theorized to depend on cultural distance. So this is kind of our model. We also included 2 additional institutional variables that captured the differences in regulations and laws, because we wanted to see, well, would the results change if we include additional institutional variables or not? Okay. And in terms of operationalizing cultural distance, we did it all. So we included all of the different cultural frameworks, the mathematical formulations, formats, and in essence, in the end, we had 30 unique approaches to measuring cultural distance. So that's a great variability. And believe it or not, I was able to fit the results on a single slide. So this is going to be at first a little bit overwhelming, but I will explain. So let's see what's happening here. So on the left, you see that we tested first a simple model that only included the moderation effect of cultural distance. That's model 1. In the second model, M2, we included additional institutional variables. And we did this for aggregate measures as well as individual measures. We did this also across the Hofstade's 4 dimensions, 6 dimensions, and Schwartz's dimension. And we applied all of these different mathematical formulations. So Kogut-Singh, Euclidean, and absolute value. And just even if you look at the results, just a quick snapshot will tell you that there are consequences to the choices that we make. So the way that we operationalize and conceptualize cultural distance has an impact on observed effects. And it has impact not only on the moderation effects of cultural distance, but these effects also change whether other institutional variables are included in the model. So if we look at it, what you see here is that these effects actually can change from negative to non-significant to even positive, which is kind of contrary to theoretical expectation. But that's a great variability. And what we also note is that if we include the additional institutional variables, it doesn't actually weaken the effect of cultural distance. It does the opposite. It actually makes the moderation effect much more observable. And we see the same results with much more actually variability and uniqueness when we look at the individual dimensions, which you see here on the bottom. And what you see is that some individual dimensions actually have predominantly negative effect, whereas some have positive. Some are non-significant. So you see here that based on the choices that we make, the observed effects can differ greatly. Now, I would just like to say a word of caution in terms of interpreting the results of the individual measures, because there is a high correlation among these constructs, which can affect the results. So it's just a word of caution. But the key takeaway from this slide is that our choices do have consequences. So what should we do about it as a field, as a discipline? Let's look at some recommendations. And what we do is that we offer recommendations when it comes to conceptualization, and we offer two sets of recommendations. Foundational guidelines refer to kind of the basic scholarly expectations, something that we all as scholars should do. And then we propose a set of advanced guidelines that go above and beyond that, but we believe should also be applied in our research. So let's first look at conceptualization. At a bare minimum, we should seek transparency and justification for our choices. So we need to make sure that cultural distance is explicitly defined in the research, which was not so when we conducted the overview of the literature. We as scholars should also provide a rationale for whether we're using a cultural distance as a mechanism, as part of a theory, which means as a proxy, for instance, for transaction costs within transactional economics, or whether we're using it to simply compare national contexts or differences between the cultures. So we believe that these are the foundational guidelines. However, we can also go a step beyond that. And one could argue that certain cultural frameworks are better or should be aligned with the type of phenomena that we're studying. So for instance, Hofstede dimensions may be more appropriate for firms and managerial decision-making, whereas Schwartz, that focuses more on values of culture, would be more appropriate for studying consumers. We also argue that it is very important that when we cite prior research, we should cite papers that applied and used the same conceptualization and measurement of cultural distance. Why is that? Oftentimes we position our work by highlighting mixed findings in the prior literature. But these mixed findings can actually be a result of the different ways we conceptualize and measure cultural distance. And so these all should be aligned. So these ones are some recommendations when it comes to conceptualization. We also offer some recommendations in terms of measurement. And what we argue that absolutely the way we measure a construct should be aligned with its definition. Okay, but beyond that, what we also argue that the choice of the format, the dimensions, as well as mathematical formulation should really be driven by theory, because theory in general should drive our studies, and it should also drive the decisions that we make in relation to cultural distance. Okay, so the type of format that we use and the dimensions and so on. But going beyond that, we believe that it is also important that we should actually report the results of different measurement formats, report the results with our individual dimensions, as well as full dimension analysis, as well as results across different mathematical formulations, because that could provide insights into robustness testing. Now, some of you might be thinking that this is a tall order, because if these results are not consistent, it may present problems in the publication process, which is true. So that brings me to the last point of recommendations for editors and reviewers. So At minimum, the editors and reviewers should really require a theoretical justification for the use of cultural distance, how we use it, and also demand internal consistency. But going beyond that, we also argue that the editors and the reviewers should really be more focused on the choices that the authors make that are theoretically driven, rather than focusing on the statistical significance. Because we as a field need to be very careful about encouraging authors to engage in p-hacking or p-harking. And so the key takeaway from these recommendations is that we really do not propose a single approach. Rather, what we argue for is that we as authors should base our decisions based on a theory. So the theory should drive our decision making. We should also make sure that we are explicit and transparent in our research, which means explicitly report the dimensions that we're measuring, the formulation that we're using, reporting the formulas that we're using, and so on. Okay, so those are the key takeaway from our paper. So thank you very much. So I will stop sharing.
Thank you, Teresa. And I will move us into the Q&A. So the first question came in, and it actually came in quite early, and it is for all three panelists. It's appropriate for all three presentations. And it states, given the current scenario with virtualization of work due to social distancing promoted by COVID-19 pandemic, are some dimensions of the measurement of Hofstede, such as individualism versus collectivism, still valid? What's your opinion? So let's start with Wolfgang first this time, since Palitha started last time. Then we go to Teresa, then Palitha.
Okay, I'll try my answer. So I think we need to look into what do cultural dimensions really measure and what do they mean. And I think they represent values of different countries or cultures. So if we think that being individualistic or being collectivistic is a certain cultural value, then an external event like the COVID-19 pandemic doesn't really change that value. It would just mean that maybe in a country which is more individualistic, we are more comfortable with working socially distanced as compared to if we are in a country which is more collectivistic by its values. So I think we could use still the dimensions of Hofstede, for example, individualism, collectivism, to see if social distancing makes us more comfortable or uncomfortable in a country depending on its cultural value, which would be an interesting hypothesis for research.
Teresa?
Thank you, Wolfgang. I would actually agree with your approach. While I believe that the virtualization of work will have a significant impact on all of us and perhaps some of our cultural values, I do believe that the individualism and collectivism almost becomes more important when we're handling the pandemic. Because if you actually look at the reaction across the world, culture had or appeared to have there was a lot of connection between whether the culture was collectivist or individualist in the way they responded to the handling of the pandemic. So I would argue that on another level, it actually is becoming more important, right? Where in some cultures, it wasn't a problem to put on the mask because they were concerned more with the collective, whereas in other cultures, this became much more problematic. So that is my take.
Palitha?
Yeah, I also agree with Wolfgang and Teresa. I think, I also have another point. I guess because now we rely on these static measures that was measured probably some time back. But I guess these things will change now because I think world as a whole might become more individualistic. So I think collectivist countries probably become less collectivist, or as a whole, I'm saying, and individualistic countries even become more individualistic because, we have less collective activities now because of COVID, I guess.
Excellent.
Can I just ask a follow-up question?
Please
Just
do.
a broader question related to Hofstede and the measure, in particular, the cultural distance. Well, I mean, when we wanted to invite our panelists, with David, we're talking about it, and we purposefully decided to focus on the cultural distance and pick papers that look at the distance measure, but not necessarily the culture part. But of course, it's hard to discuss this topic without reference to the conceptualization, the theoretical foundation, and what we are measuring actually, right? I mean, I think Wolfgang and Palitha and Teresa, they've done a great job of summarizing the consequences of our choices, or what some alternative ways of looking at this distance measurement issue, or some of the issues, problems associated with this particular measure. But for me, the big elephant in the room is what we are trying to measure, and the fact that we're using Hofstede values and norms, which have been criticized extensively in the literature, and that's probably going to be one of our next webinars as well. We're going to invite some people and hopefully have a lively debate about the culture. What is national culture and how we measure national culture? And Hofstede, for me, should be just abandoned. I mean, I'm just going to say it there, and maybe, you know, some people are going to be upset with me, but I mean, if you read the Hofstede's book and the scale items, I mean, I can't see how one can conclude that, you know, those items are related to power distance, for example, or uncertainty avoidance. I don't know how anyone can measure power distance using those particular measures, but well, some people, I know that, you know, this might be a little bit controversial, and a lot of people are using, including myself, national culture and operationalized national culture using Hofstede might not be very happy with that. But I would really like to hear your thoughts on this, since, you know, this is cultural distance, and you have done a lot of work on the distance part, but what are your thoughts on the culture part, on the conceptual side of this discussion? That was a long question, I know.
Who would you like to start, Ahmet?
Let's start with Teresa, maybe, and then Wolfgang, and then Palitha.
Oh, you put me first. Honestly, yeah, you know, I am not sure where I stand on this issue. I agree. The Hofstede's dimensions have been criticized, and there are certain weaknesses to it. However, it also has been the one most widely applied, most widely used. And I guess the issue is that do we have anything better that we can start using, that we can adopt? Because in our research, what I thought was interesting is that the Schwartz and Globe measures were used only from 2007 or 2008 until 2015, but weren't used past 2015, which I find interesting. So I guess the issue is, yeah, there are issues, but do we have something better?
Yeah, but I have most certainly been using the Hofstede measures in my paper and for describing the geometrical measurement. Yet I must say, and I totally agree with you, Ahmet, that it is certainly time to move beyond the Hofstede measures. Looking into the items, I totally agree with you. I don't really see how they all go together. There's not really enough internal consistency in these items. Yet I also see, and an argument that we frequently hear is that Hofstede is being used because it simply works. I think, especially being as a mathematician, I find this a bit of an oversimplification of what we do. I think we should still all be giving Hofstede a lot of credit for starting this field and for actually coming up with the idea of cultural dimension. That really, this credit really goes back to him. But after so many years, I think it is time to move on, to try to find something new. And I think what we have done today in this seminar and this webinar is a good way of talking about new methods, new different approaches, And quite honestly, I believe in our field of IB, we should be doing this a lot more, even in terms of publications. Just look at different methods, different approaches. They need not be perfect. But that's, I think, how we can develop methodologies, by just bringing in a discussion and trying to find different new measures, different new methodologies.
Yeah, I also agree with that. I think new methods, new ways of thinking. I think, for example, I don't know what to ask about culture. So maybe like unless I go to other countries and see how people behave, I don't know whether you can capture these differences in culture based on a survey question to start with. So maybe you have to find these little differences, the way people behave, where people do certain things. And I think, I might not have the cultural intelligence of others in order to build, let's say, a new dimension, if you know what I mean.
So let me pose this question to the panelists, and we'll go Palitha, Teresa, Wolfgang on this one. So all three presentations take the position, at least to some degree, that the existing way we've been conducting research may be completely wrong, or at least at a minimum could be misleading. As such, when we approach doing work using the construct of cultural distance, how do we approach the extant literature and findings, given that the measurement could be inaccurate?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, David, because as I said, for example, these exaggerating the cultural distance when you're using a co-potential index, it will depend on how large the distance is. So, and then, so these biases will depend on what you are doing. Say, for example, if you're going to fit a U curve, you're going to fit a W curve. And that's completely different. I don't know how you can interpret it. Let's say someone finds a U curve and say, oh, I found a U curve, it fits well, but actually what he has found is his data fits to a W curve. I don't know how to go, how to interpret that result. So it's challenging. Yeah, I think the best. Probably one way is to do replication studies and look at the differences, perhaps.
Teresa?
I agree. We can't exactly go back in time and reuse the old data. So I completely agree with Palitha that perhaps replication studies, or perhaps just looking at the same phenomena using a different approach and see how the results differ, could perhaps bring some more clarity. That is pretty much all I can come up with.
Okay, now I had a bit of more time to think about my answer. And I just want to go back to one of my slides. On that slide, I had shown, and Palitha had similar slides in his presentation and his publication. I had shown a difference between a measurement angel of heterogeneity and the Kogut-Singh index. And while there are differences, and while there's, the differences fan out, while the differences are getting bigger, I mean, there's still a trend line in here. So the angel of heterogeneity, the Kogut-Singh index, and the Mahalanobis index, and the Euclidean distance index, and whether we do this on Hofstede or on Globe, do not necessarily measure totally different things. They are just measurements of different accuracy level. So the Mahalanobis distance is slightly more accurate than the Kogut-Singh index. And I believe that my angel of heterogeneity is more accurate than the Mahalanobis index. But this doesn't render the previous research results in IB research models totally inaccurate. It might, if we have like findings with borderline statistical significance, it might either render them correct or incorrect. But as long as we have a finding in a research model based on cultural distance, with whatever measure that we have used so far, which is highly statistically significant, then I would say whether you exchange these measures or not, will still give you a statistically significant result, just because they're all correlated with each other.
Well, if I may, I think, it's not all bad necessarily, because we've been using some of these measures, even, with some conceptual flaws. At the end of the day, that's how science progresses, right? We just realized that what we did 20 years ago, 30 years ago was not good enough. And now what's next? Then maybe Wolfgang is going to come up and say, hey, this is how you should use. If you're going to use that, Teresa is just going to say, this is the way we should be using. I like your, one of the, the recommendations table. It's excellent, easy way. And, if you want to dive deeper into it, then that's what you need to do. At the end of the day, when I look at your correlation table, I mean, you didn't share that, but I had your paper. There, for example, I mean, the correlations are pretty high, regardless of whether you're looking at Hofstede, Schwartz, especially between Hofstede and Schwartz, the correlations are at 0.8, 0.9 levels. And even some of the institutional dimensions that you are capturing with regulation, rule of law, etc., they also have, that's what I'm talking about. They also have very high correlations. So yeah, I mean, we are used to explain 30% of variance in our models, 20% of variance in our models. And in this particular case, it's no difference, but we're just going to move on and hopefully do better and use stronger methods to be able to address these issues. And that's why, I mean, I really appreciate all these comments. And well, that was one of the purposes of actually this session. We really wanted to hear from you guys we just wanted to hear from you guys about how to address those limitations.
So we have another question in the Q&A. Second order constructs such as culture, trust, and so on are problematic. Their proxy just multiplies their validity problems. Duhem Quinn philosophy challenge reminds us that it's impossible to isolate them. Which I would agree with. I think this is one of the great challenges of our field, but also one of the biggest issues. And there is a recent paper that talks in JIBS that talks about, maybe instead of focusing on differences, we focus on similarities, because it's the similarities that drive our behaviors oftentimes, because we tend to, through our cognitive biases, try to avoid the differences the best we can. With the remaining, we just have a few minutes remaining before we thank everyone, but I would ask if there's any one piece of advice each of our speakers would like to leave the audience with. So as all of our participants are working on trying to publish their research, they're probably running into reviewers such as yourselves. If there's one thing going into the submission process when using cultural distance that they should be thinking about, what would be that one piece of advice that you'd like to give them? And we will go Wolfgang, Palitha, and then Teresa.
Okay, my wish and would be that we are looking, both as reviewers and journals, we will be much more open into using different mathematical methodologies. I do not think that in our field of IB we have yet explored what computational mathematics at all can actually provide us. We seem to always be jumping on the latest trend. At the moment, it seems to be a fuzzy set qualitative comparative analysis. Some paper being published somewhere about a methodology, and suddenly it becomes the big thing to do, and everybody seems to have to do it. I would really wish that we would be focusing a lot more on methodologies and trying to develop the field of methodologies specific to IB forward.
Excellent.
my advice would be like when someone publishes something, you have to make sure that what you do is proper. I guess the mistake that Kogudan Singh has done has a lot of ramifications, because I don't know why they have divided it by 4, because the Euclidean distance is a standard measure, and why you want to use a standard measure and then create something completely different and create all these issues. So maybe if you're not sure, maybe you should not publish it, or I don't know. Maybe you have to be a bit more serious about your research, and then make sure you're absolutely right. Because to be honest, like when I was, I can still remember the conversation that I was having with my co-author. Like when I had found out this issue, I was thinking, I was telling my co-author, how can we publish a paper on this? This is like Euclidean distance, the Pythagoras, all these things are like very basic mathematics. How can we publish a paper out of it? And then the issue is there is a paper that has been heavily cited that is wrong in that sense. It doesn't have the basic mathematics thing. So I think, yeah, sometimes I think we have to be more careful, I guess, thinking about the long-term ramifications of what we do. If we are not absolutely sure, then, and then I think another issue here is it's very difficult to challenge the status quo. So actually, when we were writing this paper, we never hoped, like we didn't imagine, like we thought that we would never be able to publish it. So I think we were fortunate enough to find an outlet for the paper.
Fair enough. Thank you, Palitha, for sharing. I will have to base my recommendation based on what I talked about today, and that is the increase in transparency and the theoretical justification within our research, because the fact that we found that our choices could lead to actually opposite effects is a little bit concerning. And also some of the concerns about us really seeking to publish research that's significant rather than research that is theoretically driven. And so, as Palitha said, right, challenging the status quo is very difficult. And so within the review process, it's very difficult, but we need to try to push the discipline forward, and be more transparent, be more open, include other measures as well, other formats, even if the results are not consistent, because that's what will help us truly understand better what is the role of cultural distance in the international marketing.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I know I speak for Ahmet when I say to our speakers, thank you extremely very much for coming today. Palitha, it's 1:30 a.m. in the UK. We greatly appreciate you, burdening with us through this. Thank you to all of our attendees. It's been a great webinar. I want to give a shout out to the cyber director at Texas A&M University, Katie Lane, for allowing Ahmet and I to go on this venture of research seminar series. So I think Katie and Monica, our staff member here at A&M, and then at MSU, Rhonda has done a great job helping us out. And so I want to say from Texas A&M University side, thank you very much to everyone for attending, and hopefully it was very helpful. There's a lot of issues. I'll turn it over to my partner here, Ahmet, for closing comments.
Well, David, thank you very much. Well, I'm enjoying these webinars a lot. I'm learning from our panelists, as well as from the questions that we're getting from the participants. So we're going to continue doing this, and I think we're going to touch on these various issues in international business and marketing. And this was a great discussion. And thank you for the useful insights and tips related to problems and limitations of the cultural distance measure, as well as the best practices for using cultural distance in international business and marketing research. And well, for the participants, thank you for joining us as well and for your questions. And on behalf of my team at Michigan State, I would like to thank you, thank the panelists for joining us today. And of course, our partners at Texas A&M University. So it's always a pleasure to work with you. And we're looking forward to seeing you again in one of our events in the near future.
Excellent. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening or morning, Palitha. Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.